Hello everybody and welcome back to our seminar series, Glocal Agenda in the Arts Management Research, Interrogating, Redefining and Changing Traditional Research Canons. So the whole series is here because we wanted to expose the diversity of research projects, exciting, fascinating, interesting, that are happening here in Singapore and inspire all interested, and especially my beloved level 3 students, to do more research, more quality research, and more applied research. So today's seminar number 5, there are only 6 in this series, so we are almost there. And we are discussing very important, very critical, very provocative question and issue, decolonizing arts management research. So let me first introduce you the moderator. We are very happy to have with us today Adeline Kuer, who is a visual artist, co-founder of the Critical Craft Collective Singapore and the Pan Borneo Serpun Collective. She's a senior lecturer with the MA Fine Arts program at LASALLE College of the Arts, and she has exhibited and presented at conferences internationally and is a consultant for a number of research, lifestyle, field art, architecture, and design projects. So, and I'm very, very happy to host today our keynote speaker, Dr. Angela Poon, who is an associate professor of English literature at the National Institute of Education at Nanyang Technological University. Her research interests include post-colonial theory, contemporary Anglophone literature, and Singapore literature. She's also the co-editor, she's actually co-editor of many books, and the editor of many books including Singapore Literature and Culture, Current Directions in Local and Global Context with Routledge. Another one is Writing Singapore and Historical Anthology of Singapore Literature in English with National University Singapore Press. And she has published extensively in many peer-reviewed prestigious academic journals discussing the issue of post-colonial literature. So let me just invite Angelia to the floor right now, and we'll start with her keynote.
Thank you very much, Natalia. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here. I know it's a Friday evening and you probably have lots of things you want to do and lots of places to go to, but I hope we'll be able to keep you focused at least for 1 hour, and because I think that what we have lined up is quite an interesting discussion. So for me today, I only have 10 minutes to talk to you, but what I want to do is really to give you an introduction to 2 critical paradigms that may inform your research, and I really hope that you will take these 2 paradigms in mind when you think of your research topics. So let me begin first by talking a little bit about my own background. I am a post-colonial literary scholar, so my work focuses a lot on Singapore literature, but from a post-colonial angle, which I'll go on to explain in a bit. So, but it's only in the last few years that I started to read more about decoloniality, which is, I would say, a parallel field with many overlaps. So it's not totally alien, it's not totally unknown to me, but I think there are different nuances, different emphases, and so I use that to try and uncover some gaps in my own work and try and see whether I have missed out certain areas of research. So this talk came about because I was looking very much into decoloniality as I was examining Alfian Saad's play Merdeka. It's a play by Alfian as well as Neo Haibin, right? And that was a play staged in 2019. You may remember when we had our bicentennial commemoration, right? 1819 Raffles came, and so we commemorated that event, right? So the play was staged in relation to that. And as I was examining that play, I was drawn to quite a bit of work by the decolonial studies. So, but first of all, let me explain where I'm coming from with post-colonialism, right? Post-colonial theory, post-colonial studies, I think is quite well known. It's already an established field of study, and in many places around the world you will find a post-colonial department and universities offering post-colonial courses. If you wanted to give post-colonial studies a kind of birth date, most people give it the year 1978 with Edward Said's publication of a very well-known book called Orientalism, in which he basically suggested that the West kind of created the East. And what did he mean by that? Created the Orient. He meant by that the West created the East through a discursive construction, because of all when you have travelers through literature, through all kinds of narratives about the Orient, they kind of made the Orient in the image that they wanted it to be. So much the East as a debauched, luxuriant area, as opposed to Western rationality and science. So most people can trace the history of post-colonial studies to that, to the publication of that particular book. Okay, key thinkers whom you may already be familiar with, especially thinkers like Gayatri Spivak, for example, and Homi Bhabha. And the key themes that post-colonial studies scholars tend to look at: nationalism, decolonization, hybridity, and that again might be something that you are interested in. Cultural hybridity, the marrying of different cultural traditions, perhaps because of colonialism, right? Because of the cultural exchange that colonialism, violent as it is, also often forced into place. Many people think that post-colonial studies is passé because they think, oh, we are past colonialism, right? All the countries that we know of are really decolonized already, so why are we still talking about it, right? But I would say that it still has its relevance, and its critical methodology is worth keeping. And as Robert Young says, the issue now is to locate the hidden rhizomes of colonialism's historical reach, of what remains invisible, unseen, silent, or unspoken, right? So even though colonialism as a historical, political fact may be passé, colonial structures, colonial systems of thought, how we think, what we classify as knowledge, that still remains with us, and that needs to be unpacked. And again, as I said, we always have blinkers on when it comes to certain things, and maybe we still have lots of, and we definitely have lots of different areas that we still need to uncover and to excavate. Decoloniality, to understand that, as I said, it's a parallel field. So to understand decoloniality, you need to understand the concept of coloniality, right? And coloniality was a term that Peruvian sociologist Aníbal Quijano first used in an article, where he says that coloniality is the foundation of what we understand to be modernity. Okay, so we consider ourselves modern people, and we understand modernity to mean a certain thing because it is informed really by coloniality, right? And you might see coloniality as the kind of as the darker side of modernity. Okay, why does he say that? Right, many of the scholars in the decolonial field go back to a longer, to take a longer historical frame to talk about imperialism and colonialism starting from the 14th and the 15th century, unlike post-colonial studies that tends to focus more on the 18th and 19th century. Okay, so with that period, we're talking about, for example, Christopher Columbus's discovery of the Americas in 1492, and with the Renaissance, which you might know, people tend to think of it in relation to a flowering of arts and sciences. Decolonial scholars point out that these events took place alongside colonialism, violent imperialism, etc. So what we understand to be modern, what we understand to be aesthetic, is kind of closely intertwined with the very nature of colonialism, imperialism, and extractive and exploitative capitalism. Okay. So So the decolonial scholars emphasize the need to make visible, open up, and advance radically distinct perspectives and positionalities that displace Western rationality as the only framework and possibility of existence, analysis, and thought. Okay, so this is not something that the post-colonial scholars are also not would disagree with. Okay, nevertheless, I think that both critical traditions come from different genealogies. They have different genealogies, and they also tend to focus on different areas. That's why they have developed in parallel, but also quite divorced from each other. Key thinkers, I think, I'm not sure if you're so familiar with decoloniality, but these are some of the key thinkers. So what are the differences? Right? So as I said, post-colonialism tends to be more Anglophone, focused on the British intellectual tradition and the British Empire. So this is very much the tradition I'm coming from, or that I was trained in. Right? Post-colonialism is associated with metropolitan centers and universities, meaning the scholars tend to come up in associated with Western universities and to have been based in these Western centers. The focus is on colonialism itself, right? The period of colonialism, as well as the processes and the politics of colonialism, and also a focus on post-colonial decolonization. So by this I mean the moments of nation building and independence, so much like in Singapore's case when we became independent. Okay. One of the issues with post-colonialism is that it has tended to stick to the nation state as a way of understanding and examining issues. Okay, and again, that is nothing wrong with that, and a lot of good work has been done by looking at the nation. However, what tends to happen as a result of this is that we may miss transnational connections, we may miss pre-colonial links, which have important cultural consequences. So decoloniality, as I explained, has a longer historical history, historical tradition that they fall back on, as I said. So more 15th century onwards, which they see as the basis of understanding Western civilization. Another interesting, I guess, a feature of decolonial studies is that there is somehow a closer link among different sites, not just the academy, not just the universities as the site of production of knowledge, but there are links between academic groups, artists, and activists. Right? Again, not that the post-colonial scholars would disagree with this, just that historically that has not been so evident in post-colonial studies. Okay? Again, they stress here the link between modernity and coloniality, right? So there is this link is very important because if you think about it, it's very difficult to unthink modernity. It's very difficult to unthink who we are and how we've accepted certain things as normal and as rational, for example. Decolonial studies, to me, offers more transnational possibilities so that you're not so bound in by the nation state and restricted to national borders when you think of how works might speak to each other. Okay, and I think for you especially, maybe this idea of praxis, of embodied learning and embodied thinking is something that resonates with you, and decolonial scholars tend to emphasize this a lot. Okay, so implications for literature, humanities, the arts. For me, working in Singapore literature, one thing I found that I think a decolonial approach would help is paying attention to the multilingual nature of Singapore literature. Again, because post-colonialism has tended to emphasize the Anglophone, all the literary people tend to work in silos, right? I have very little communication with people working in Chinese literature in Singapore, Malay literature, etc. Whereas I think that needs to be rethought, so that's one implication. Thinking of Singapore in relation to the region and to other networks, and not just in relation to the West, that's something that decolonial studies would push us to think more carefully about. Okay. Can we decolonize our curriculum, our university? Can we change the way we think and understand our knowledge categories. For example, knowledge categories pertaining to race, for example, which is very much a colonial legacy, right? And the question here, why do Singaporeans tend to think of colonialism as benign? Right? Why is Raffles still standing, whereas a few years ago, so many statues of slave traders and people who participated in slavery, those statues came down all over the world, but Raffles is quite secure in on his pedestal, right? So, not saying that we should pull him down, but why do we have him there, right? So that needs, I think, thinking through. I feel that post-decolonial studies also brings in the question of indigeneity and asks us to think a little bit more carefully about local sources of knowledge, local traditions, local aesthetic traditions. Right. Interrogate colonial categories of thought, which, as I said, race, for example, is one. Right? And then to think a little bit more about Singapore. Singapore adopted Western modernization as a kind of model. Right? We have decolonized. However, we didn't cut ties with the British or with the West, right? Instead, we invited MNCs, we invited foreign investment, and that's how we became what we are today, how we progressed economically. But can we take another look at this history, right? And have we perhaps been complicit in being neo-colonial ourselves, especially in relation to our Southeast Asian neighbours? Okay, so how have we used the colonial matrix of power to our advantage in the global scheme of things? That's a question that I hope you can think about. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Angelia. And now we would like to invite Dr. Adrian Tan, who will be speaking about his research practice. For those who are interested, please have a look online for the respective bios and write-ups about their presentation today. Adrian, please.
Thank you. Okay, so thank you, Dr. Poon, for that keynote. It's a tough task to kind of carry on from this, but I'll be sharing an aspect of my research that was conducted in the past 3 to 4 years. I will read from the script because I'm mindful of the limited time that I have, so let's just proceed. Hi, my research is art historical in nature, where I seek to investigate the social role of artists and the study of artistic labour in Singapore, kind of locating the hidden notes, the unseen, and the unspoken. I focus on research into performativity, art in public spaces, where today I'll be sharing about Tang Da Wu's performance art in 1987, and the Sculpture Seminar 1, which was operated by the Artist Village in 1991. But there are also other art events, like the Yin Yang Festival in 1978, Art Commandos in 88, Open Studios by TAV in 88-89, Trimurti, The Space, both in 1992, and latently, the study of the substation. And I strongly encourage students to kind of conduct further investigation and research into as well, as these are important creative notes or interventions against ideas of hegemonic power, control, or even the idea of defamiliarization. So today's presentation will focus on 2 sets of subjects, namely the National Museum Art Gallery, or NMAG for short, Tang Da Wu, the Artist Village. All these will be explored through an object, or in this case, a documentation or photos from artist archivist Koh Guan Hao. For this research to take place, the chronology of events, the details of happenings, the photos were all assimilated from interviews with the 3 subjects, namely the artist, the documenter, or the audience, or the viewer, and the museum director, Kua Chung Wan as well, the purveyor of power and authority perhaps. So my approach realigns the reading of art practice, art spaces in Singapore, away from Euro-American theories, or Ram Kuha's assertion of Singapore as tabula rasa, where he states that Singapore is a blank slate for city planners and politicians. So instead, I anchor my research on regional academics' theorization of Singapore as public space in the making, new Asian tropicalities, and the Asian modern, amongst others as well. So can artistic practice play a critical role in a society where Western democratic capitalist models have influenced city planning, artistic production, and cultural policies as well? So this research does not merely look at artworks, but around the process. The keyword will be operations of art events as key manifestations of artistic liberty and power as well. Singapore's urban history has situated the retention of colonial buildings as repositories of knowledge and historical significance, while our community spaces like kampongs and cultural enclaves are destroyed or often left unhoused. So NMAG for short was housed within the rear end of National Museum Singapore, established as the Raffles Library and Museum in 1849, colonial building, where it was later renamed the National Museum in our year of independence, 1965. So kind of designed and opened in 1976 as a white cube space, NMAG was in the corner of this larger museum, where it was at that time considered state-of-the-art, where, I quote TK Sabapati, its policy of renting up its gallery space on a first-come, first-served basis was very much criticized by him as well. So Sabapati criticized what was then Singapore's largest art exhibition space as surrendering its role in determining the nature and quality of exhibitions, as well as not having a sufficient budget for artwork acquisition or exhibition display as well. So predominantly because NMAG played host as a hired space to art shows in its 7 galleries, as you've seen earlier on, ranging from shows supported by Goethe Institute and other foreign embassies, featuring printmaking, design, children's art, and occasionally a live screening of football matches during the World Cup as well. So its identity was very much kind of in the flux as well. But I think lesser discussed by academics and theorists are actually the performance art events and this series of seminars that took place in NMAG. So NMAG has largely been forgotten under research, where I argue through the larger paper that we need to look more closely at the programming and the running of the gallery, as well as through the archival repository of events in understanding its role in advancing contemporary art practice and becoming, most importantly, an incubation space for critical artistic interventions. So it was in '88 where the Advisory Council on Culture and the Arts, or ACCA, recommended that SAM, with the larger resources, opened in 1996. It was to be established as a fine arts gallery in the former St. Joseph Institution. So this resulted in NMAG's closure after about 18 years. So running forward to two key findings that underpin the research. Number 1, artist Tang Da Wu, curator Sabapati, museum director Kwa Chung Guan, and members of the artist village were vital public interlocutors who filtered through events that took place in NMAG, where there was a reflexive and a critical role expounded through their kind of intervention as well. Number 2, the operative, this idea of the dialogue or the dialogical and the exhibition opportunities behind the sculpture seminar conducted between 91 and 93 were important platforms for collaboration between a public institution and a local individual. This would influence or come to influence a later generation of artists from Koh Guan Hao, Amanda Heng to Lee Wen within their practice that involve performativity, archiving, and organizing future art events, festivals, or conferences as well. So the kind of end of the Singapura and the Iskandar rooms were actually open notes for 2 weeks for exchanges and ideas of art, and formalism took place as well. This is rarely spoken about, where artists as well as the public were invited to attend talks conducted in the Theaterette, as well as discussions taking place concurrently with German artist Joseph Beuys' exhibition. All these were very new experiences for local artists as well. So this idea of the artist, independent of curators, advocated an open-ended process through seminars, a systematic reflection of sculpture engagement in and with its surrounding spaces, where performance art was infused and introduced to participation as well. So the outcome of such an engagement was not to lead up to the production of objects, but I quote, explore fresh concepts and procedures in sculpture making at the theoretical and practical levels as well, allowing the public access to these endeavors. So in the final press release I saw earlier on, a sculpture seminar was positioned as an open-ended event where the public was encouraged to voice their opinions. For anyone who is interested in doing sculpture could attend each session. So in conclusion, a sculpture seminar was a cooperative, a processual, and a public-facing experimental intervention, where the role of the artist as a disruptor, a creator against hegemonic power, was made possible through collaborative efforts between the artist, the institution, and the individual as well. As a result, there was a form of deterritorialization of the colonial culture institution through modes of operation, and I quote, a collective appropriation of common spaces. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Adrian Tan. I would like to invite Sunita next to present. I'm very cautious of the time, and we really hope for a very vibrant conversation afterwards. So, Sunita, please.
Thank you. I'm going to be about 6 minutes. And I've also prepared a speech. Don't start timing it. I've also prepared notes because I mean, you're all my students, you know that if I don't stick to the script, I will just go on and on and on. So, let us begin. Okay, so hello everyone, good evening. I need to start with a small apology for false marketing because I realized I didn't want to talk about findings. I want to talk about my approach to research within the question of decolonization of arts management. So the title does state the subject area of my work, but what I'll be focusing on here is issues to do with conceptual frameworks and the challenge of developing theory for our local contexts. And part of this is in recognizing and analyzing what's problematic or inapplicable with the concepts and frameworks we have, which are mainly from the West. I want to first establish my positionality in this endeavor as a full-time educator after working in the arts as a career arts manager and one who is specifically Western trained. That point, Western, is pertinent to our theme. I teach history and contextual studies as well as an MA module on strategies and leadership in arts and culture, which is about business strategies. And the textbooks we use, the theory we draw on, is overwhelmingly from the West, Euro-American traditions and concepts of work, labor, economy, governance, and government. This necessitates rethinking and adapting and questioning the applicability of what is being taught and in fact promoted with what the realities are in local contexts. It's also been very much about making sense of many things that I knew instinctively or as a matter of embodied knowledge, but I'm now trying to figure out how this works as a matter of scholarship. So I'm using my time today to acknowledge scholars in Asia who are instrumental in shaping my views and thinking and share some key points from literature to set the context. First, the problems of a Western and Eurocentric model of arts management are not new and have in fact been highlighted by scholars in the West. For example, in his 2010 book simply titled Arts Management, Derek Chong has highlighted how the coming together of management and the arts was seen as a mark of respectability. And as we know here in Singapore very well, ideas of professionalization are very much linked to an acceptance and in fact emphasis on certain systems and ways of work based on a Western trajectory, particularly that of funding and the corporatized structure of governance to ensure accountability. Arts management as formalized within higher education has its roots in the experiences of arts organizations in the United States during the 1960s, which brings with it an assumption of what Chong calls a monolithic and universal arts management based on American hegemony. It is fundamental that we as educators be acutely aware of such assumptions and biases, both hidden and sometimes blatant, that underpin much of what is contained in our textbooks and circulates as accepted and lauded truths. In fact, this is what the project of decolonization in education is, and this I think resonates with Angelia's keynote. It's nothing as dramatic as the toppling of a statue of a colonizer, but the understanding of the effects of colonialism on language and scholarship and systems of knowledge. I take a cue here from the Open University's 2019 report on innovating pedagogy on how decolonizing in learning and research is about considering multiple perspectives and making space to think carefully about what we value. We need to identify and recognize the ways we are shaped by colonialism. We need to examine and reflect on our professional practices. And we need to include indigenous and local knowledge and ways of learning and doing. My work, therefore, proceeds in tandem, while simultaneously documenting through primary research the habits, activities, organizational behaviors, support structures of arts workers and artists in collective and network systems in Southeast Asia. I am also constantly trying to deepen my understanding of the existing frameworks and structures which we inhabit or which impact local arts ecosystems. We won't always have the right theory to apply. It's instead about developing new knowledge and possibly generating new theories. I would like to mention more, but in the interest of time, we'll highlight just the work of two scholars in Asia that have been very influential in framing my thinking and whose respective practices are extremely localized and context-specific while being internationally informed and engaged in a process of exchange. The first on the left is Jerry Liu. His work in cultural policy is renowned not just in Taiwan, but internationally. And he's made a compelling case for the reorienting, which is a play on Taiwan being in the Orient, but also on the idea of Orientalism and orientation of cultural policy, where he uses history to examine cultural governance and recent attempts by Taiwanese civil society to reformulate it. A scholar of cultural policy, Jerry has also been a driving force in community organizing with civil society groups to facilitate grassroots discourse on cultural policy with government officials, and the Taiwanese model of citizen engagement in culture is an inspiration. Janet Pillay, with her groundbreaking work on education and communities in Malaysia, is a tireless advocate for place-based learning, using modern tools and processes to investigate traditional knowledge which may embody historically significant ecological, aesthetic, economic, social, spiritual, or scientific value. Their work and that of others like them are rooted in local context and bottom-up development of knowledge. And some, like Janet, work in community-based or oriented settings, developing strategies and analyzing local knowledge systems alongside and with local communities. Systems are a central characteristic of management theory, but need to be rethought and assessed with fresh perspective. So this is my last slide with information in it. I conclude with a reference of a very recent arts management text by Kenneth Foster. His book, Arts and Cultural Leadership, Creating Sustainable Arts Organizations, attempts to understand unsustainability, a reflection on how did we get to this current state of events in the world. His book brought me to Kagon's work critiquing the Western mode of knowing inherited from the classical modern scientific method with reference to several scholars, two of which I share here. Systems thinker Ervin Laszlo's opposition to a classical view as inherently Eurocentric, where he advocates for a new systemic view and acknowledging that the Eurocentric classical worldview took Western industrialized societies as the paradigms of progress and development. The second is Romanian physicist Basarab Niculescu's critique of the classical modernistic praise of objectivity as the supreme criterion of truth and which transforms the subject into an object. Reading this, I couldn't help but think about the ways indigenous histories have been viewed, from the dismissal of the Malay annals, the Sejarah Melayu, the written genealogy of the Malay kings, as fables and quote-unquote preposterous fiction in the 19th century, to the appalling and brutal treatment of native peoples and the denial or destruction of their cultural objects, rituals, and belief systems in the 16th and 17th centuries in the Americas, Africa, and Asia as colonialism spread and took root. It is unavoidable for us in the arts management field to not draw on Western scholarship, and texts such as these offer as a historiographic context for widely accepted theoretical models that are in fact based on a legacy of extractive capitalism and Eurocentrism, thereby amplifying the call for a more nuanced and critical reappraisal of what best practice might look like in local and non-capitalist contexts. The arts management field is still young and growing in Southeast Asia, and we need to avoid imposing frameworks that present a Western and capitalist bias and work from the bottom up to seek new understandings and perspectives, despite the tension between embodied research and the imposed need of for academic theory in an academic context. At this stage, I have more questions than answers, and I look forward to continuing this in the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Sunita. Last but not least, we shall have Jason, who will be speaking to us.
Thank you very much. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for having me here. For my presentation tonight, I'd like to share with you an ongoing research that obviously I'm doing. I'm still at the very early stages, okay? And I'd like to call title the presentation From Outreach to Cultural Exchange, How the Cultural Center of the Philippines is Decolonizing the Mind. To begin with, it's very important that I share with you and help you understand the context in the Philippines. Now, as I've said, this is an ongoing research that I'm doing. It stems from and it is influenced, inspired by previous research that I've done on cultural governance and cultural participation. And as I dig deeper into cultural participation, I pleasantly stumbled on new discoveries. And part of that would speak to, may not necessarily be on decolonization, but speak to relationships of people within the conversations of cultural participation. So, as I've said, it's important that I give you a context, a brief context of the Philippines. Now, the Philippines has a long history of being colonized, more than 350 years. Having been a Spanish colony during the 16th century, the Philippines gained its independence from Spain, or Spanish rule, in 1898 through the Acta de la Proclamación de la Independencia del Pueblo Filipino. But while the Philippine flag was raised, Spain sold the Philippines to the United States in the same year, in 1898, through the Treaty of Paris. And the Philippines was under, again, the American rule for almost 50 years, under a colonizer, until the Philippines was occupied by Japan during World War II in 1942. And it was only until July 1946 when the nation attained its independence through the Tidings-McDuffie Act. Okay? So that alone tells us how deeply colonized we are. That if we speak of Asian countries in Southeast Asia, some Filipinos may not feel that they're really Asian, but we are brown Americans. So that's one factor. Another factor, and I'm sharing this with you, if you're not familiar, this is the Philippine map. Okay? And as you can see in the Philippine map, we have over 100 ethno-linguistic communities. You can see that here, right? These are all languages and a lot of ethnic groups all over the Philippines. Okay? Which also adds to the complexity of cultural participation, the national government or through the national cultural institutions working with different cultural communities in their work on cultural participation. Okay, now having shared this context, here's how we were colonized by Spain, obviously very under the cross of Catholicism and under the education of the Americans. So as a consequence of long colonial history, Filipinos have internalized a sense of cultural and ethnic inferiority. Such mentality manifests itself strongly amongst those in the periphery, outside of the capital city of Manila, while power and authority are perpetuated by national institutions that have replaced the colonial powers and now are seen as the holders, the bearers of power. And how they perpetuate that is through the idea of serving the public, which then creates a savior complex. I'll talk more about that later, or through the questions. So over 100 years later, colonial teachings continue to oppress Filipinos due to their colonial mentality. This is an internalized oppression, a feeling of oppression, of being under someone's rule. Again, in the less than 50 years of American rule, William McKinley, then the US president, created the benevolent assimilation, which construed our identity as Filipinos, as brown Americans. And with that, Filipinos have argued, or Filipino intellectuals have argued, that before a cultural intellectual revolution begins, one has to first challenge the dominant and hegemonic apparatus in the realm of politics, democracy, economy, arts and culture, and by also looking at our mentalities in engaging art and cultural production and events in the Philippines. So, with that, as I've said, it has created this mentality of a savior complex. We're always looking for, and I may be generalizing, someone who will save our souls or save us, and thus creates the relationship of national cultural agencies or institutions with those in the periphery, or the regional art centers, or those in the grassroots communities. Okay, but the cultural center of the Philippines has been trying to change this conversation and this narrative. Okay, although the cultural center of the Philippines is one of the national cultural institutions, it is changing that narrative in the process of decolonizing the mind, highlighting aesthetic values in people's art for greater appreciation of sensibilities that evolve from local history and identity, and empowering those in the periphery. Okay? Brenda Fajardo, a Filipino visual artist, arts educator, and community organizer, recognizes the growing menace of westernization as people's art remained undocumented, understudied, and ignored. Okay? She argues that decolonization can be achieved through the documentation, preservation, and dissemination of the various forms of people's art by imbuing craftsmen a sense of pride of their work as an artist of the people, and not only by incorporating people's art as part of the curriculum, but Filipinizing, quote-unquote, the arts program in the primary, secondary, and tertiary levels of education. When we speak of people's art, it's recognizing, for example, the amulet makers in Quiapo, the native mat weavers in Sulu and Samar Leyte, the lantern makers in Pampanga, the basket weavers in Ifugao, the jeepney painters in Sarao and Cavite, the wood carvers in Sulu, Paete, and Betis, and those who comprise the lower strata in Philippine society. Now, all those that I've mentioned are arts and craft all over the Philippines, and not just in the center of Manila. Which then I would like to focus on these words, okay? How does the Cultural Center of the Philippines change this narrative or challenging this narrative? Initially, the term outreach to those in the periphery has been used, okay? But then when we dig deeper on the meaning of outreach and how it is understood in the local language, we translate that into pag-abot, or an aktibidad ng pagbibigay serbisyo. This means that, again, someone in authority, someone has the power and the resources, is doling out or giving service, okay? Giving a hand to those who don't have the means, okay? The Cultural Center of the Philippines wants to change that by not using the word outreach, but instead using the word cultural exchange. And they are pushing this to their arts education and cultural education divisions or departments. Because when we understand exchange in Tagalog or in Filipino, we translate that into the word pakipagpalitan, from its root, palitan, which is to barter or to shift, and further digging into the origins of the word kapalit, wherein it highlights or it stresses reciprocity, right? Thus, again, changing the narrative, that it's not a power over, but it's a sharing of culture. And with that, I'd like to end my presentation with a few reflections. That, number one, decolonization of the mind as the process of reducing colonial mentality may begin from questioning, from challenging, from critically looking into the terminologies and the categorizations that we use in education, in cultural management, in cultural governance, in relationships with state and grassroots organizations. Thus, emphasizing the idea of cultural equity. Now, what is cultural equity? Simply put, cultural equity explicitly values the unique and collective cultures of diverse communities and supports their existence in physical spaces, in public policies and investments, and in expression in civic and spiritual life. It values the recognition and support of diverse and distinct cultures and the bridging and sharing of those cultures to build strong and interconnected communities, towns, and cities. And it explicitly addresses legacies of structural racial discrimination and remedying of institutionalized norms that have systematically disadvantaged categories of people based on race, ethnicity, customs, gender, identity, citizenship, and so on and so forth. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Jason. So now I'd like to invite all our speakers, starting with Dr. Angelia Poon, Dr. Adrian Tan. Please feel free to be seated wherever you see fit. Sunita Jana Mohanan, yes, Jason Vitorillo. So we will share mics. And let's start off with if there are any burning questions from the floor. I think we're all very excited about the topics in a pre-seminar discussion that we had earlier, we were like saying, let's keep all the time for all the conversations that we can have. So let's start off if there's any burning questions. Yes, please. Could I just, I think I may have to pass you the microphone.
I'm interested in Dr. Angelina's area. How do university help academics in your area of research to validate, like, what were some of the evolving KPI, or were there platforms that can help support that study? Because in a way, like, it's a new field, and there will always be some sort of, I would suppose there might be some sort of marginalization, because like the paper has to be validated, published somewhere, but if it is not in a Euro-centered kind of publisher, like how do you guys push for? And within the context of the visual arts, it's also the question, like, I came across the article long ago, like you're questioning, do Asia have a great museum? It sounds like a good effort, but if you think carefully, they were like questioning whether there's an equivalent of a Louvre. But then you fall back, you fall back to the Western model. Like, how do you address that?
Thanks very much for that question. Yeah, that's a very good question, and I think it is something that we all have to think about, because we all belong to the institution, right? So in many ways, it's hard to, and I'm not advocating that we reinvent the wheel or demolish things altogether, but I think there is a great deal of scope for reflection, and certain things are within your power to do, for example. So one of the things that I have been seriously thinking about, when we write papers, we always quote so many scholars, especially using Western scholars and Western paradigms. But I think it might, we also need to think about regional and local thinkers, and I think that's something that Adrian talked about. And in many ways, for my field, literature, I think we have been quite slow and not caught up so much with contemporary arts in other areas of arts and cultural studies in that respect. So that is one concrete way I think we can go about doing it. And also in terms of exchange and all that, I know every time when we have exchanges, we somehow valorize the West, and even when our students go for exchange, it's always the West. But maybe we need to rethink all that, and as part of this decentering of the West. Not totally jettison the West, because that would be impossible, but I think this whole idea is about kind of decentering and recentering. Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, Sunita.
I actually want to respond to that question of is there a great Louvre in Asia? Because I think the question is nonsense.
Precisely.
Yeah, because we shouldn't be making such a comparison in the first place, and we also have to bear in mind how the Louvre got to be the successful museum it was.
Precisely. You see, that was, I hope you didn't read it wrongly, but that was precisely what I was concerned about. How in the article, the article meant well, but the article assumed that the Louvre, without a Louvre model in Asia, then like how do Asia carry on its contemporary art?
Yeah, so we have to reject those questions. I think we
precisely that's where the problem is, and I acknowledge that.
The reference point being always the
and
center.
And recognizing how the Louvre, the context of the Louvre as well, and the fact that half the artifacts in the Louvre came from
Pilfered.
Yes, and the way that the French got rich enough to build the Louvre. I think we always have to bear that in mind and reject the question outright.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I think I am taking a cue also from Jason's presentation. Pakiki pak, palitan, that's right, which is to barter or to shift. Now, why do I begin with that? Because I'm thinking about some of the most salient concerns that we have as educators or as researchers and artists would be to find sources, local sources, and therein lies the issue also with the limits of language. So I'm actually curious about how, if the panel members could share about those concerns about the limits of language in your present processes, to include more texts that are away from the conventional Euro-American knowledge systems, and what are some of the things that you have had to make to the reading list or research materials to make it more accessible, particularly in light too with how many Southeast Asians or Global South communities are deeply rooted in oral tradition. So would anyone like to start?
Hello. Just very quickly, I'll go back to what Sunita shared a while ago, that it's not to move away or discontinue referencing Western models, right, or concepts, but it's also to recognize that there are tons of concepts, ideas, models that have yet to be written about or have yet to be unearthed, and perhaps it's a challenge to go back, at least in the context of the Philippines, to go back before the colonization of Spain, because there is already an existing civilization, and to look at the values that is held by Filipinos, pre-colonial Filipinos, and the very systems and models and concepts that they're bringing in terms of talking about culture and the importance of culture in one's identity, perhaps.
Thank you.
I think to kind of respond to that as well, in relation to absorbing Euro-American theories, I think it's important to also think of time, because I guess in researching into Singapore cultural / literary history and contemporary art history, there is a model in which you could extract information from the French, from the German, or from the Western thinkers, like the idea of public sphere from Habermas. But I guess in looking at local academics, you can also look at urban studies, in seeing how architectural scholars may have repositioned the idea of, for example, public space into public space in the making, in kind of asserting that in Singapore, our public space is still in its infancy. We have a certain time frame in which post-independence, we have developed certain activist works in 2023, but in the 80s and 90s, it was still in its infancy because of how public spaces were still under control. A lot of times you have to get licenses, for example, post-92, for example. So I guess that's where I'm coming from, in which it's important to not just blindly assert that, okay, I'm using the theories of Chantal Mouffer's kind of look at activism and art, and using that to assert into a Singaporean context. I think it's important to kind of reflect on our local scholars as well, who may have also conceptualized their theories using Euro-American theories, but modified it to better suit our context, be it Philippines, even within Indonesian and Philippines and Thai art and culture studies as well. I think that becomes quite important, to kind of address, once again, the removal of seeing our culture through another lens.
Sunita, anything to add?
I think it looks on.
Yeah.
So for arts management, I think we do have.
It's not quite.
I think in arts management we have a bit of a challenge. I certainly draw on, at least I try, to include as globalized of a curriculum, the reading syllabus as possible, and include sources that are regional or local. But when it comes to arts management, the entire business model is predicated on a capitalist one. And I think that is unquestioning. And also there are not a lot of books and texts on arts management or management that we can use that's local or even regional. I think there is quite a good deal of scholarship happening in East Asia, China, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Japan, Korea, but they're all in those languages and we don't have a lot of translation, so we can't avail ourselves of those enough. So part of our challenge is trying to completely deconstruct the ideas of capitalism when we think about what we're teaching our students, in order to look at alternative models of how artists or arts workers might be gathering, organizing, making art, especially for those that choose not, and there are quite a lot who choose not to engage with the market. So I think that's the particular challenge that we have in arts management.
I think you were talking about some of the limits of language, right? Yeah, and in terms of what the rest of the panel was saying of critical discourse. But I think for literature, we also have a fundamental problem in terms of the primary text being written in different languages. And for me, effectively monolingual, I can only read it in English, right? So I'm reliant on translations. And I think more and more so, translation becomes a very important, it may be a very fraught process, but it's a very necessary process, and that's the only way in which you can gain access, I think, to a different point of view when it's written in a totally different language, for example, right? And just to give an example, in Singapore literature, when my students read some Malay novels in translation, for example, they realize a point of view that they would never get in the Anglophone tradition. It's because we have been brought up, in silos, effectively, and the CMIO model is, of course, a colonial legacy, and that has dictated the way in which education has been done, and also how we read, right? So by reading Isa Kamari's novel 1819 about Sir Stamford Raffles, a historical fiction of, based on that particular moment when Raffles was here, that gives you a totally different perspective, right? And for Anglophone readers reading Confrontation by Muhammad Latif Muhammad, even in translation, you get a different sense of what independence meant. And so we are reliant on translations. I'm not sure how that works for the arts, because maybe for theatre and for contemporary art, it's somewhat different. But for literature, when it's the written word, we have no choice but to rely on translations, I think.
Okay, thank you, everyone. I'm also thinking how earlier on today we were having some conversations between some curators and artists, and we were asking this question about how there are many programs being launched in academia, for example, and what does that mean what does that translate to the young graduates coming out? Like, if you have more curators and arts managers and artists, what are the prospects that would be available, seeing how small Singapore is, for example? So one area clearly for most of you researchers and artists and writers out there would be to also look at translation, as it has been rightfully pointed out, the emerging area. And I'm also thinking about the nuances for bilingual, trilingual speakers. You understand the nuances of specific languages that sometimes are lost in translation. Yeah. So with that, I'm actually going to open up to the panel members to, if there are any questions that they would like to ask each other first before I proceed.
Perhaps I'll just comment on translation as well. I guess in a research area like visual arts or contemporary art, you would be looking at various content analysis as well. And I guess one area would also be looking at the press. And I think within the Singaporean context, be it visual arts, theatre, music, etc., you should look beyond Straits Times. you should look beyond the English press, because if you look at 1980s, 1990s Chinese newspapers, they did a lot of brilliant reviews of exhibitions, shows, music, theatre, etc. as well. And also the Malay press as well. Yeah, so I think these are two areas you could look into. And one search can really give you quite a lot of information, or you can go to the library to kind of look through the microfilm, etc. So I strongly encourage researchers to really look at the vernacular language, maybe even Tamil as well. So I think these three areas as well. And lastly, transnationally, in researching into like Tangdawo's practice, I also had to kind of look at Japanese exhibitions, Fukuoka Museum, etc. And there were a lot of very good curatorial writings and historical references that you could pick up from Japanese pieces as well. So I think these are a few areas to look into, transnationally as well as locally beyond Straits Times.
Can I just add on, because the point about language is a really interesting one, and I am reminded of a bit of research that I was doing for a book chapter, where towards the end of it I was really depressed because I felt that I completely was shut out linguistically, because the subject was a Hakka village, and I don't speak any Chinese dialect. And I realized towards the end of my work how different the way the people I'd interviewed spoke to me in English. And as an international researcher, even though we were Malaysian, I'm from Malaysia and it was a Malaysian place, compared to if they were speaking to someone who could speak to them in Chinese or in dialect. And that there were also publications that I couldn't access that had been written about their history, and I couldn't access them at all. And language is so political. So even when you don't have to be talking about politics, but the way something is phrased in one language and phrased in the other can have such a completely different meaning. And when you are, I'm not monolingual, I can speak Bahasa, but my working language is English, my professional language is English. And I think as a researcher in this area, trying to be as inclusive, trying to bring in so many voices, incorporate them, you have these obstacles that you have to deal with, your own language bias, and that's quite a challenge.
Yeah, just two things very quickly. It just reminds me of decades ago when I was still practicing theatre, wherein instead of staging things in English, because I was part of a touring theatre company, we stage a work translated in different languages. So depends on where we go within the Philippines. And also reflecting on my research, or in doing research, it does give me a much more interesting story when I speak with people that I talk to in their language. Not that I know so many Filipino language, but in their language, once you move away from English, and even once you move away from Tagalog or Filipino, and speak of Chabacano, Visayan, Yakan, then it's where the stories become richer. Yeah.
Yeah, just to add that I given the difficulties of translation, I think one thing that comes to mind therefore is the importance of collaboration and collaborative work, which also actually takes me back to the first question that you raised. You know, what do universities prioritize and privilege, right? And oftentimes collaboration takes time, might take you away from your publications, right? And so in a sense also we are caught therefore in that double bind, right, of what the institution values and whether or not there is enough time given for such work, which would take quite a lot of effort.
The undercurrent issue that I was trying to raise, the undercurrent issue that I was very interested in was that there were many interesting scholars who were very interested and committed their life, their time, their effort, their blood, literally their blood, to doing good works. But when it comes to KPI evaluation, when it comes to tenure, you know, like that's where I'm coming from. Like,
Yes.
what else can be done? What are the platform that can help support them? You know, that's where I'm coming from.
Now, I appreciate the clarifications too, but I'm also thinking of how, Angelia, you brought up a really good point about collaborations, because that's the next one. due to the fact that we cannot fully understand a language that we are not scolding fully, and even then, even if you're a native English speaker, you can't know everything about English too. So, and because of that dilemma that we have with translations and with knowing a language as much as possible, working collaboratively would be the best way forward. And in the process of unpacking, trying to unpack these processes, the problematics of colonialism and cultural imperialism, and that point about post-colonialism being more a continuation or a critique of colonialism as opposed to a direct cutoff. That's really significant in how then we continue with the unpacking, taking apart these processes. For me, we just have to, I guess, keep pushing, because I remember as a young artist in the 90s in art school, when I interviewed a number of Asian women artists in Vancouver at that point in time, one of the activists, Haruko Okano, second generation Japanese Canadian artist activist, said, "We need people like you." She assumed that I would be in academia, which is not wrong in a way. And my supervisor then, Jimmy Yoon, Korean Canadian artist who's having a revival in some ways, she said, "We need people like you to work from within the system." So it's a long and tedious process, sometimes quite thankless, but I think we do, like, I can sense how deeply invested all of us are, especially the panelists tonight, and I'm thinking about the different ways in which we could continuously unpack the knowledge systems, the structures, the operating models and frameworks from within as well. And I'm just wondering if if you have anything to add, or and in light of the timing too, if there's one final comment from everyone. No? It's good, yeah. So with that, I would like to thank all our speakers today, Dr. Angelia Poon, Dr. Adrian Tan, Sunita,